Thank you, President. I guess they're not waiting for me. I rise to speak on the Bail Further Amendment Bill 2025, and I would like to start out by echoing the comments of my colleague Rachel Payne that everyone has a right to feel safe in their homes or in the streets. This is a very live issue in my electorate. A recent survey by the RACV and Neighbourhood Watch focused on how safe people feel in their homes. People in Western Metro recorded the state's lowest safety rating. They are concerned about home invasions and carjackings, as residents have been increasingly subjected to these terrifying crimes. So we are in no way discounting those people's concerns or dismissing their fears. They are entirely legitimate, and I am sure that sentiment is shared by all my colleagues in the Legislative Council. Where there is not such unanimity is how, as a society, we respond to these crimes and these perfectly reasonable concerns. Now, in our view, and that of a wide cross-section of the legal fraternity, the police, community leaders and community workers, these new laws, the Bail Amendment Tough Bail Bill 2025 and the one before today, are reactionary responses to complex issues which will push more young people through the revolving door of disadvantage and incarceration. The government claims its first tranche of reforms are working, and the Premier stated, and I quote, "The changes we made earlier this year are already working. The number of bail revocations and people on remand has increased." Now, if the jail were to simply lock up more people, then you could say that those laws are working. However, if they are supposed to reduce crime and make our communities safer, then we have to say, as I think most of the community would say, it's not working at all. The Premier went on, "We're bringing more prison beds online. Almost 1,000 additional adult prison beds will open, and a further 88 beds will open at Cherry Creek and Parkville Youth Justice facilities." Now, I find the Premier's enthusiasm for bringing more prison beds online quite depressing and, frankly, deeply frustrating, because evidence shows us that jailing young people does not decrease crime or enhance community safety. We are not the only state in Australia to go down the lock-em-up tough-on-crime route, instead of addressing the underlying factors that see young people ending up in the criminal justice system. The Northern Territory government is very big on jailing young people, very, very tough on crime. Indeed, if the Northern Territory were a country, it would have the second highest incarceration rate in the world, second only to El Salvador, and well above Russia, China or the US. And surely no one wants to be at the top of that particular ladder. The NT recently amended its youth justice laws to remove detention as a last resort for children, despite overwhelming evidence that it inflicts profound harm on children and inevitably sets them up for reoffending. But phew, with all those bad kids in jail, it must be the safest place in Australia. Well, sadly, no. There's no evidence that putting more people in jail reduces the crime rate or makes the community safer, and the Northern Territory is a case in hand. In New South Wales, we have more proof of the failure of detention to create safer communities. In 2024, the Minns government, in another example of headline-grabbing tough-on-crime posturing, trumping evidence-based policy, introduced its own reforms to the Bail Act. Warned that it would increase prison populations, namely with more vulnerable children already overrepresented in the justice system, and do nothing to prevent crime, New South Wales passed legislation which actually made it harder for children to get bail than adults. A year later, the results are in. Youth detention rates have increased by 34% in just 2 years, with nearly 60% being Aboriginal. Do the good burghers of Sydney feel any safer as a result? Of course not. Every jurisdiction to adopt tough-on-crime bail laws for children has seen higher rates of children detained and higher rates of reoffending with no improvement in community safety. And if people aren't moved by the trauma inflicted by these policies on vulnerable, overrepresented communities, maybe the very high price tag will bring a tear to their eyes. We know that young people who end up in the criminal justice system are far more likely to experience greater levels of poverty, social and economic exclusion, family violence and housing insecurity. Of course, people need to be held accountable for their actions, including children. It's not about minimising crime or its impact. But we cannot keep funneling young people through the justice system only to spit them out into the same cycle of disadvantage that led to their offending in the first place and that will most certainly lead to reoffending. We need community-led solutions at the things that actually do build community safety. One thing that does help, and is certainly a damn sight cheaper than locking kids up, is keeping them in school. I've seen this figure so many times that it never ceases to blow my mind. It costs $7,500 a day to keep a child in detention and $6,000 a year to have them in school. Now, I've spoken before about Target Zero, a program aimed at ending the criminalisation of vulnerable young people in Brimbank, Melton and Wyndham, and reducing their overrepresentation in the criminal justice system to zero. Project 100 runs concurrently with Target Zero with the goal of 100% Year 12 completion, and there is no doubt that there is a correlation between these two percentages. Foundational supports that address the drivers of crime lead to greater community safety and a reduction in crime, better supports for schooling, drug and alcohol dependency, mental health, family violence and homelessness. Alas, we never seem to find the money, but it's blindingly obvious that these are better and cheaper alternatives to building and staffing jails. $7,500 a day to detain a young person, $6,000 a year to educate them. Another cost-effective way is to reduce crime in my electorate is to fund the Wyndham Law Courts precinct for its full suite of therapeutic court lists. It will be to the detriment of the whole community if Wyndham opens without them. The government committed to a range of therapeutic courts, including a drug court and a Koori court, in the 2021 budget. But it is unclear whether these specialist courts will ever be resourced, despite being cheaper to run than mainstream courts and effective in reducing recidivism. It is profoundly depressing that these amendments will pass and become law, but at least we knew that we were in for it this time around. It's no less disappointing, however. These new measures will not make the community one jot safer. To quote that most eloquent of American baseball players, Yogi Berra, "Oh no, it's déjà vu all over again." And I like the irony of that quote, given this legislation introduces a second strike rule. A whimsical coincidence in this discussion, but a tragedy for the marginalised communities who will be traumatised by that rule and the consequent uplift provisions. We need to stop seeing this as a binary issue, tougher policing and harsh justice versus therapeutic and restorative measures. For all the shrill headlines about youth crime wave epidemics, we are talking about maybe a couple of hundred kids who are recidivists and who are generally known to the police. I might add that I am very heartened by the fresh approach to policing that our new Commissioner is seeking to bring to the force. I might add that in the past, we have seen established police task force to deal with these particular cohorts instead of passing sweeping laws that disproportionately impact upon a broad swathe of vulnerable people. But perhaps those sort of solutions don't lend themselves readily to pithy, biting sound bites. My colleague has moved an amendment to include a sunset clause in the bill to review the high degree of probability test after 3 years, and we will support further amendments requiring additional safeguards for vulnerable and overrepresented groups. We do not support the government's bill. There are effective and proven ways to reduce crime and keep communities safe. The bill before us today contains none of these. Thank you.